Welcome to the ICAP Gens lecture on the Introduction to Scandinavian Genealogy. My name is Jenny Hansen. I'm an accredited genealogist and I specialize in Scandinavia. My accreditation is in Denmark and I've been accredited for a little over 20 years. I'd like to tell you today a little bit about some of the principles and methodology that you'll need to know if you plan to accredit it in Scandinavia or if you just want to become a better researcher. So before we get looking at our foreign records, there's a few things we need to know about an ancestor. We need to know the full given name of an ancestor and their specific place of origin. If you just know that your ancestor came from Norway, you're going to have a lot of records to look at before you can find anything concrete. So the question comes up, where do I find this information? I know that we all love doing research in foreign records, but sometimes we need to use the records on hand in the US before we can delve into records in our foreign countries. So finding information like the specific place of origin is best located in things like an obituary, immigration records in the US, any church records in the US, different information like that. So before you ever even try to get into these records, you're going to have to do a little bit of US research, and you're going to need to be familiar with the sources that will lead you there. Once we do get into foreign records, in Scandinavia, the bulk of your research will take place in the Lutheran Church records. So we're not so familiar today with this idea of a state-run church. For those of us living in the US or even just in modern Europe today, we don't associate church and government very often. But for our ancestors, the Lutheran Church was an arm of the government. So that means all church employees, a priest, a clerk, whatever it may be, were actually government employees. And more importantly, for our purposes today, any records created by the church became the state records. So we don't really talk about things like a birth certificate or even civil registration when we're talking about our ancestors in the early 1800s and even beyond that. We're looking at the records for the Lutheran Church because those were the records that the state managed and cared for. When we get into the church records, there are a few events that would parallel records that we would think of as like a birth certificate or death certificate, something like that. So it's a little bit different, but the ones that I have starred here, the christening record, the engagement record, and the burial record would be like a birth, marriage, and death, our three big vital records that we're hoping for everyone. So christening would be hours to a few weeks after a child was born. The engagement or the marriage record, it might state an intent to marry. It might be a record of the actual marriage. Either one is fine. Whatever was recorded by that parish will work out great for you. And a burial record, it may state the date of death, but it might just be burial. And we know that that's going to happen very shortly after a person dies. So other records that we see taking place in the church records are things like a confirmation record and then the incoming and outgoing lists. So a confirmation record for our ancestor means a test on their knowledge of the catechism. This took place around age 14 or 15, and it's helpful because it will have the individual's name and it tells who their parents are and where they're living. And at this time for our ancestors, a lot of them were not living at home with their families. A lot of them were working either as a house servant or as an apprentice or something like this outside of their own home. And this confirmation record helps us to track them at kind of this pivotal time in their lives. Incoming and outgoing lists, I think that's pretty self-explanatory and yet a different concept again for us in modern times. So at this time when our ancestors were living, it was important for the state, for the church, for everyone to know who had responsibility and accountability for different individuals. What jurisdiction did that person fall under? So if there were any legal issues, any welfare issues, which priest, which congregation was responsible for the welfare of someone. So these incoming and outgoing lists were to track where someone had been living and where they were going to. And as a genealogist, it's a great record to have access to. The big concept that we need to understand as strong Scandinavian researchers is this idea of linking patterns. Now, in Scandinavia, we find that there's a very small pool of names used in high repetition. So maybe 10 names for a man, 10 names for a woman, that in different combinations are the given name and the surname. So it's very, very easy to catch people who don't belong in the family and to increase our family group inadvertently, or to leave people out of our family group inadvertently. In an effort to make sure that we have these nice, tight, complete family groups, we look at these linking patterns, and they're a very helpful tool for us. So I'm going to go through each of these in detail, but we talk about names, siblings, chronology, geography, occupation, and social status. Our first linking pattern has to do with names, or surnames in particular. I think the big thing everyone thinks about when we talk about Scandinavian ancestors is patronymics. And that's the practice of taking the father's given name and adding son or daughter and using that for the children's surnames. So my last name is Hansen, meaning Hans would be the father, and Hansen or Hans' daughter would be all of the children of Hans. Rather than looking for the same surname to be carried out throughout generations, we're looking for that father's given name to attach to all of his children. And then in reverse, for his father, we would look at the surname and determine what the father's given name is on that. So while it creates a bit of a challenge, really it's easy to get used to. It's just training your brain to think a little differently. So the example that I have shown here says Michael Lauritzen Muller. And I'll talk about that last part in just a minute, but let's talk about Michael Lauritzen. So his father's name would be Lauritz. Sometimes it would be abbreviated to Lars. But if I'm looking for Michael's father, I'm not going to look for someone with the surname of Lauritzen. I'm going to be looking for Lauritz, somebody who had a son named Michael. As you could imagine, we might see a lot of people with the same name in the same place who are about the same age. The example I always like to ask people is, how many of us are related to Hans Jensen? Well, the answer is everyone's related to Hans Jensen. We're all probably related to a lot of Hans Jensens. And it's important that we figure out a way to determine which Hans Jensen belongs in our family group. So these other surname examples that I have listed here are ways to help us determine if we have the correct patronymic family. So everyone still has a patronymic name. So like we see here, Michael Lauritzen. But if there were a few Michael Lauritzens living in the area, the priest, the neighbors, everyone would have a name to help determine which one. And in this case, it's Michael Lauritzen Muller, which means the miller. And other occupational surnames that I see all the time are things like the smith, the mason, the wheelwright, the baker, the grocer, all of these different potential occupations that can be tacked on after the patronymic name to help determine who this person is. And these occupational names may pass for generations. It might just be that one single generation and not go on beyond that. We also start to see things like different localities or farm names being tacked on for a different surname beyond the patronymic name. I grew up surrounded by families with great Swedish farm names for their surname. So I had neighbors with the last name of Lillenquist, Lundberg, Lindquist, and the list goes on and on. And as a kid, I never paid attention to it, but now as an adult and as a genealogist, I know these different locations or these different surnames had tagged into locations within Sweden. And I just think that's a great thing to be able to tie your family back to that farm where they came from. So in these instances, again, we would still have that patronymic name and then the location tacked onto it. And a lot of times when our ancestors immigrated back into the US, they would drop the patronymic name and just hang on to the location or the occupation name, or it might be the other way around. But that's these different types of surnames we see. The last one that I have called out here is a name for physical features. So an obvious one for all of us is like Eric the Red, with his red hair, and his child was Leif Erikson. So we have all these different ways of having our family groups linked together through surnames. And even though they might not be the most traditional patronymic name, or they could be, there's different ways of having these generations tied together. Similar to that, our next linking pattern is with siblings. So naming patterns becomes a huge thing when we talk about the sibling groups, and as well as timing. So I love this picture. I love this darling Scandinavian family and their traditional dress and just a whole mob of kids. So when we talk about a Scandinavian family, we have to remember that our ancestors had a lot of children, and the women had children pretty much until it killed them. So when we talk about siblings, we need to look at the timing of this. The first child was usually born about a year after that first marriage. It may have even been before the marriage. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But then children were born about every 2 years from that point on. If we see a gap larger than 2 years, it's a great indication that we have missed one of the children somewhere. If we see children born too close together, that's a great indication that we're accidentally pulling another family into our same family group. So we need to look at the timing of these kids and make sure that it all lines up, that we only have kids in what could be a logical course of time. I want to talk more about the naming patterns for children because this is a huge one. So like most families in Lutheran Europe, we have a really solid naming pattern for children. So we see these given names in patterns for children throughout Lutheran Europe. Today, we like to just pick a name for children based on a name that we like. But our ancestors didn't do that. Their given names, as well as their patronymic names, all tied them to different generations within the family. So we typically see the first two sons named after the grandfathers, and the first two daughters named after the grandmothers. So I've got a pattern here where it's paternal grandfather, then maternal grandmother, paternal grandmother. Those can be interchanged. Just realize that usually the first two boys are the grandfathers, the first two girls are the grandmothers. And then the subsequent children would be named for aunts and uncles, other important people within the family. On occasion, you'll see some great, for like a seventh or eighth child, you might see some Norse god thrown in there for good measure. And I always smile at those and think how fun to have a kid with a great Viking name. But our families reuse these names over and over again. And it was a very common practice to see if a child was deceased very young, they died in infancy, then there would be a child who is named with that same name, right, repeating. So if you see two girls back to back with the names Anna, that's a good hint that that first Anna probably died very young. Our next linking pattern that we're going to look at has to do with chronology. So the best way to explain the idea of chronology is to use, I tell people all the time, just use your brain. Does the timing make sense? Does this look logical? Is this a timeline of family events that could happen for anyone? We mentioned a little bit about these children's birth years. Are they born too close together or too far apart? Another one is the marriage year. We like to fantasize and romanticize that our ancestors all married as young teens, and that's not the case at all. In Scandinavia, the average marrying age for a man is about 25, and for a woman, about 21. Like I mentioned too, we usually see that first child within the first year of marriage. It's very common and not at all scandalous to see a child born before the marriage. Once a couple had agreed that they were going to be husband and wife, they typically started living as if they were husband and wife, even if the marriage wasn't taking place for a while still. A good idea, a good rule of thumb is once you have what you think is your family group, put together a timeline and ask yourself, does this make sense? Does it look logical? Do I have big gaps where events should take place and no record for it? Or do I have extra things added in that probably belong to another family? Chronology is a huge one in genealogy because if we just can use our brains and think what logically makes sense for this family group, then you typically can figure out the best course of action to take with your research. Our next linking pattern has to do with geography. At one point in time, I had siblings living in every time zone of North America. And we thought that was kind of cool and fun. But our ancestors never would have had something like that happen. They just did not have the mobility or the motivation to go very far beyond the parish where they were born. So, whether that be an urban area or super rural, they just stayed close by. And in fact, at one point in time in Denmark, there was a law requiring all men to stay within the parish boundaries of where they were born. And this was for military purposes, so that they would know how many men they had available at any certain time. Um, the big thing to remember on this is that sometimes you will see, because of, again, the repeated names, you'll see events linked to your ancestor that the time might work out and the event might work out, but it's clear across the country or hours away from where your ancestor was living. That is a huge red flag that you have grabbed someone who does not belong in your same family group. So the key for geography is to remember that our ancestors usually stayed close. They just did not have the flexibility and the ability to move around like we do today. There are a few tools that are really helpful for us as we work on this idea of locality and geography. The best one is the Family Search Research Wiki. So I've got the Norway page pulled up, but these tools exist for all of Scandinavia and in fact for most countries around the world. When we pull up the page for Norway in the wiki, you see all of these links to different research tools and helps. But as you continue to scroll down the page, you're going to see a clickable map. So at the bottom of the page, here we see all of Norway, and it's broken up by different counties. Again, this same type of map exists for both Denmark and Sweden as well. So my ancestors that I'm interested in lived in Telemark County. So I can click on Telemark County on this map, and it's going to break down Telemark County for me even more. Here's the map of Telemark County. You can see here it's broken down by parish boundaries. I love these maps for this. We've got the different color blocks, but within that you see some of these have dotted lines, and the dotted lines indicate that these parishes shared a priest and that the books sometimes were merged together. It's within the same jurisdiction, even though there's separate parishes. But I can click on the parish I'm interested in, and it'll break things down for me even more. It'll tell me the years the records are available, and my most favorite tool within this is that it shows me the names of all the different farms and towns within a parish. So you can see how this tool might be really helpful when we're trying to figure out the geography that relates to our ancestor. My next linking pattern has to do with property. If we're lucky, our ancestors were poor rural farmers. The reason I say if we're lucky is because it's easy to trace these guys. They stayed put, they were in the same parish for a very long time, and the parishes, the record books are smaller because they're less populated. The trick with the property is that any hold, any tie that a man had to property would be passed down to his children. So a lot of our ancestors didn't own property, but they leased or they had some type of a bond to the land, and that claim would be passed on to their children. So the next obvious question then is, well, what about the subsequent children? My ancestor was the fourth son. What happened to him? Well, he wouldn't have had access to the property like his siblings did, but he probably still stayed close. He may have married into a family that did have these property rights. And when we're trying to narrow down our family groups, it's always great to be able to look for that farm name or that town name, some type of location that can tie it very specifically together. Like I mentioned, we could have 3 Hans Jensens living in the same parish at the same time. But if we know the name of the farm that our Hans Jensen originated at, we can look for that farm name as a tag to know which group we're looking for, to make sure we're not grabbing extra people. And then the last different linking pattern I want to talk about today has to do with social status. Our ancestors did not have the social mobility like we do today. So if they were born into a merchant family, they probably died in that same merchant class. If they were the poor rural farmers, they stayed rural farmers their whole lives. Everyone loves a great Cinderella story, and we want to be able to say that our ancestor was the poor farm girl and the estate owner's son fell in love with her and rescued her from this life of drudgery, but that never really happened. Our ancestors stayed within the trade and within the social structure that they were born to. So another thing to remember with this is similar to the idea of property being passed down. Trades were passed through generations. I know of multiple generations that were wheelwrights or brick masons or different things like this. These specialized trades passed down through families, and it's another great way to be able to tag our family group and not be grabbing someone else. I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to some principles for Scandinavian research. If you have any questions as you get going or as you try to improve your skills, I would love to be able to help you. Feel free to reach out to me through the ICAPGen webpage. Again, my name is Jenny Hansen, and I wish you the best of luck in all of your research endeavors.